they're overstretched and they're traumatised. Traumatised by dealing with London Bridge, traumatised by Grenfell Tower, yet they carry on doing it, overstretched and understaffed. We need to look at the whole issue of the security of our fire service. Those of us, Mr. Speaker, with over 30 years' experience in this House would have struggled as constituency MPs under the pressure generated by an incident of this scale. And as I said yesterday, my honourable friend, the member for Kensington, deserves praise for the tireless and diligent way she stood up for her constituents in the very short time since she was thankfully elected to this House. Her constituents need answers, and the public inquiry must address. Firstly, the appalling failure of the fire alarms at Grenfell Tower, which meant many residents reported they were only alerted to the fire by the screams of their neighbours or by young Muslim men banging on the door who had broken from prayers in order to try and save life. Something went catastrophically wrong, which lost life. And whether the advice given to tenants to stay in their homes was correct, and what advice should be given to the people living in the 4,000 other tower blocks around this country in the event of similar disaster. Why sprinklers were not installed, and whether they should now be retrofitted into all tower blocks. We need urgent answers to that question. And whether the cladding used was illegal, as the Chancellor has suggested, and whether it should be banned entirely, and what wider changes must be urgently made to building regulations. As the Prime Minister indicated in her statement, that this is obviously being urgently addressed. But we also need to address the fire prevention regulations, including the frequency and enforcement of fire safety checks, because it is my suspicion that many local authorities, strapped for cash after 7 years of cuts, have cut back on fire testing, cut back on inspections, because they simply haven't got the staff to do it anymore. And whether the tenant management organisations are responsive enough to their tenants, and what greater powers tenants need, both in council, social housing or the private sector, to ensure their own safety. Whether survivors and people evacuated from adjacent property were rehoused promptly and adequately, the Prime Minister has addressed some of that. I'd be interested in her response to those that lived nearby, who themselves are equally traumatised by the event. And of course, they should be rehoused within the borough, and I hope there will be no increase in their rent. The inquiry must also address the resources available to the Fire and Rescue Service, and whether response times and capacity are adequate for all areas of the country, since the number of wards in which response time targets are not being met has increased tenfold since 2011. Lessons must be learned in the public inquiry, and a disaster that should never have happened must never happen again. The government must delay no longer, and now implement the recommendations of the 2013 inquiry report into the Lakanal House fire. The public inquiry into Grenfell Tower must also establish whether lives could have been saved if those recommendations had been implemented in full, and if the recommendations of the all-party parliamentary group had been heeded by government. Fire safety measures cannot be left to a postcode lottery. So I ask the government to make available emergency funds, as my honourable friend, the member for Leeds West, raised yesterday, so that councils can carry out immediate fire safety checks and install sprinklers, and the timetable for that be made known to residents. There is obviously a huge cost involved in removing and recladding blocks that are found to have flammable materials included in them. That money must be made available immediately, because it is a huge job of work. And when the Prime Minister says that those people who are in danger must be moved out of their properties, this is a massive undertaking, and a huge focus of government resources will have to go into it.